Hello children, in this video we will discuss pollination. In our previous video we had discussed the plants have various reproductive organs like male reproductive organ that is stamen and female reproductive organ that is known as carpel. These two reproductive organs produce their respective gametes, that is male gamete known as pollen grain, and the female reproductive organ produce female gamete that is known as ovum or egg. But the problem with the plants is that plants cannot perform locomotion. A male reproductive plant cannot be able to go towards the female. So, how these gametes will be transferred from male reproductive organ to female? जब बच्चे प्लांट्स मूव नहीं हो सकते तो उनके रिप्रोडक्टिव ऑर्गन्स पहुंचेंगे कैसे? That we will discuss in this topic. What is pollination बच्चे? Transfer of male gamete, that is pollen, from male reproductive organ that is anther to the female reproductive organ that is stigma of the flower. That transfer of gamete is known as pollination. The transfer of male gamete, that is pollen grain, from the anther of a flower, anther of a stamen, to the stigma of a female reproductive organ is known as pollination. बच्चे pollen grain का स्टिग्मा पर ट्रांसफर होना क्या कहलाता है? Pollination. This pollination is further divided into two types. First is self-pollination, and the second one is cross-pollination. It has further subtypes, but that will be discussed in class 12th biology. So here we'll discuss the general introduction of self and cross-pollination. Self means khud, swayam se bachche. Itself. The transfer of male gamete from anther to stigma of same flower or another flower of the same plant, that is known as self-pollination. If bache will try to understand this by the help of a diagram, let us consider it's a plant. It's a flowering plant and it has this flower over it. Either the transfer of pollen grain from this part to the stigma of the same flower. ये एक फ्लावर है मान लो बच्चे. स्टिग्मा बच्चे इस pollen grain इस एंथर से इसी के स्टिग्मा पर गिर जाएगा, that is known as self pollination. या फिर let us suppose this flower has this anther and this flower has this female reproductive organ. If the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same plant, ये plant एक ही है, then both of these cases are known as a self-pollination. If pollen grain from the anther is transferred to the stigma of same flower, or pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, then that pollination, that transfer is known as self-pollination. For self-pollination, we do not require any living organism. इसके लिए हमें किसी living organism की जरूरत नहीं होती. Whereas second one is cross-pollination. Transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of another flower of another plant or another similar plant of same species. That is very necessary words, bache. The transfer of pollen grains will occur only between the same species plants, between the similar plants only. But in this case, the plants are different. For example, let us consider this is plant 1 and this is plant 2. These two plants belong to the same species. But if, let us suppose this is the flower and this is anther present over it. So the transfer of pollen grain from this anther to the stigma of this plant. अगर बच्चों प्लांट अलग हैं बट प्लांट है सेम स्पीशीज के और पॉलन ग्रेन एक प्लांट के स्टिग्मा से एक प्लांट के एंथर से दूसरे प्लांट के स्टिग्मा पर जा रहा है, देन दैट इज नोन एज क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. आई एम एक्सप्लेनिंग यू अगेन बच्चे, डू रीड इट वेरी केयरफुली. इफ द पॉलन ग्रेन फ्रॉम द एंथर of one plant is transferred to the stigma of same flower on the same plant, that is known as self-pollination. As well as if pollen grain from the anther of one flower is transferred to the stigma of another flower of same plant, then that is also referred as self-pollination. Whereas if pollen grain from the anther of one plant is transferred to the stigma of another plant of same species, that is known as cross-pollination. Cross-pollination leads to more variations as compared to self-pollination. In cross-pollination, we require certain biotic agents, certain living organisms. For cross-pollination, we require various agents, like the pollination by air is known as anemophily. The pollination by water is known as hydrophily. If the transfer of pollen grain is done by the help of water, that is known as hydrophily. If humans helps in the transportation of these gametes, then it is known as homophily. If human beings helps in the transportation of pollen grain from anther of one part to stigma of another is known as homophily. If this transportation is, this exchange of gametes is done by the help of insects, that is known as entomophily. So these are certain, agents along with their type of pollination. So this is what the pollination, the transfer of male gamete, that is pollen grain from the anther to the stigma, is known as pollination, and its type, that is self and cross pollination.